The Ask the Experts Theater at CSCMP Edge 24 is sponsored by Knopf.
Well, good morning. Welcome to this session. We're going to be talking about two important topics that we hear a lot about these days. One is supply chain resilience, and the other one being goods-to-person solutions. And why it's important for us to understand and be able to calculate the real productivities that we should see out of a goods-to-person solution once that solution is dropped into our particular operation, because it's not all the same. So let's start with supply chain resiliency. I don't like dealing in abstract, so I like to boil everything down to what it means. And so it can mean a lot of things to different people, but I boiled it down to these four things. It's being able to prepare for what is inevitable. We know it's going to happen, we just don't know how big or when it's going to happen. And to recover from those things that are totally unforeseen, that we can't calculate. But while we're doing that, we have to always protect our customers, maintain our customer base from any disruptions that occur, and we have to be able to insulate our bottom line from rising costs. So if you would kind of agree with me with that is what supply chain resiliency is focused on, that's its primary goals, then we can see how that relates to goods-to-person solutions within the four walls of our operation. So within the four walls, those 4 points boil down to two things: quality and performance. So today we're going to talk about performance. A lot of people think of that as just throughput. It's more than throughput. It's throughput, it's how to achieve effective material flow through your building. It's order cycle times, lower labor dependencies, lower variable costs, and reliable performance. So that comes down to three top performance expectations. We have throughput, then we have capacity, but what drives those two right through the middle, order cycle time, is effectiveness. That is what we're really looking for in our warehouse operations, is effectiveness. And that is often an exchange of throughput and capacity so that we can achieve the highest return on investment. So let's start with the throughput of a goods-to-person system. And let's start with that being the mechanical rates. You often hear it referred to as the bin or tote presentation rate. So that would be the mechanical rate that a system, whether it be an AMR, a cubic CASRS, or whatever, the shuttle system, whatever the system may be, right? That's the presentation rate that can mechanically be achieved of presenting a donor tote to the operator or a SKU tote to the operator to pick from. Okay, so that number could be quite high. However, that number gets affected by a lot of things. So let's start with this being the configuration of a goods-to-person, right? So first of all, we have mechanical delays. So mechanical delay could be the cycling in of a tote and out of a tote, out of the picker's work area, right? So how we accommodate or overcome these delays with mechanical delays is we'll often have 1 to 2 donor totes being in the station at a time. When I only have one donor tote at a station at a time, right, when that operator picks from it, if the operator is able to do the put and come back before the next tote comes in, there's a delay. So in order to overcome that delay, we'll have 2 or more totes in that station. So that way the operator can pick from one tote while the other tote is cycling in or out, right? So that helps achieve your mechanical rate. But then we also have to look at, are we doing what we call a one-to-one or a one-to-many or a multi-to-many? And what I mean by that is, what is the relationship of the donor totes or the SKU totes to the order cartons or order totes, right? And so we have, on the screen here, we have a one-to-one, then we have a one-to-many, and we have a multi-to-many. And so what are the advantages or disadvantages to those, right? So the one-to-one means I'm going to incur cycle time on both instances. I'm going to incur, as an operator, I could incur cycle time from the donor tote and for the order tote to come into my envelope or my workstation and to leave, right? When I have one-to-many, right, I still could incur cycle time interference on the donor side, but now on my order side, I can hit multiple orders at a time so that I'm not incurring the delay on the order side. So most likely what you would see is a multi-to-many or two-to-many, right, to try to overcome that. So it's all in the configuration. So when you start with, let's say, 600 presentations an hour, right, you have to look about, well, what is the delays? What is the cycle time? And is there any interference with the operator? And then when the operator turns to put something into order tote, how long does it take them to come back? And is that tote there ready for them to pick from? Right? Well, we're going to get into those details. Okay. So let's talk about order management. Order management is a huge thing within goods to person. Let's start, first of all, with order pool size. And what I mean by that is how many orders at a time the system has to work with, right? Because a lot of times what the system will do is it will try to take advantage of commonality of items or SKUs amongst a group of orders. So you have to think about, well, what order pool size do you have in your operation that you can actually give to that system at any one time, right? Can you give them a whole day's worth of work? Probably not, right? So then you have to look at, well, okay, if I can only give them 2 hours worth of work for that system, is what I mean. If you can only give the system 2 hours worth of work, what is the real commonality for that? And, how many orders is that at a time? And then when you start thinking about things such as your service level, right? So what happens between that time when you have order cut off at 4 o'clock, but you have to have your orders shipped by 5 o'clock, right? So that means you have an even shorter time in which you're given that system orders for it to proactively look at, right? And that's what they do. So if you give them 2, 3, 4 hours worth of work, a lot of systems will use some intelligent software. They will pre-plan, they'll group orders together, at a pick station. They may pre-pick some product and move it forward so that it's more accessible. But if you, in your operation, doesn't or can't afford that time because of how your customers are placing their orders, then that reduces the availability that they have. So if that system is heavily reliant on that kind of methodology or strategy, then that's going to affect your rates, right? And I show here in that next slide is the commonality piece. You'll often hear this referred to as a batch factor, right? They'll say, well, okay, we have a batch factor of 1.2, meaning that they think that 20% of the time they can hit one SKU will hit multiple orders, right? So the thing that you have to consider there, again, is your order pool size. Was that 1.2 calculated using a whole day's worth of work? Or was it calculated actually using the revolving or the revolution of the orders that you were giving it? Most likely, once you start slicing that order pool down to from a day, down to half a day, down to 2 hours, down to an hour, that batch factor is going to get much smaller. So if the goods to person system was designed with a 1.2 batch factor, for example, and I'm just using that as a hypothesis, right? So if you say that, well, then when you get to the order pool that doesn't have that batch factor, you will not be able to get the same number of lines because you don't have that commonality. The other thing is order and SKU selection. As I mentioned, as a strategy, a lot of goods to person systems, what we try to do is take advantage of that order pull size, and we will cherry pick, right? We will try to cherry pick, group orders together at a station, stuff like that. Well, once that order pull window gets really close and tight, being able to cherry pick windows or cherry pick SKUs becomes problematic. The other thing is, once you cherry pick those SKUs, you end up left. What you end up with is actually what's left over, right? And so now that you've made cherry pick the SKUs to benefit the productivity on the first half, the back half of your hour, let's say, is going to be much worse. So you have to be careful of the strategies that goods-to-person systems uses. I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm saying what we're trying to do here is educate you on finding those things out and discovering how they will impact you and your operation as this technology and those strategies apply to your operation. And we already talked about service level and cycle time, right? And so service level, again, if you're in by 4, out by 5, just as an example, your service level will drive much of what you can actually give to the goods-to-person system rather than what the goods-to-person system may want in order to optimize its productivity. So now let's talk about operational rate. So once the product is at the workstation, there's an operational rate. And what I mean by that is what happens to the actual operator, what actual has to be performed. And let's start by talking about pre-cartonization versus post-cartonization. What I mean by that is if you pre-cartonize your orders, let's say you have 10 different box sizes that you're shipping in, and you don't want to have packing after picking. So you want to kick off, the exact size of carton you want and have it go to the goods to operator station to be picked into so that there's no after packing, right? Great system. However, you have to be aware of what that does to the station itself. Because now what you have to do is you're kind of handcuffed to the order and the cartons and how they arrive at the goods to person stations. So it does affect your ability to kind of manipulate orders across multiple stations, right? The other thing that it does is you have to plan in that cell or that workstation for the largest carton, right? Because you never know. I think I have here in the drawing, I have 4 order cartons there, right? To the right of the operator. You never know at any given time, you may have 4 of your largest cartons in that workstation. So all of the envelopes that are set aside for those cartons have to be set for the largest size. And what will that do? Well, that will drive the operator's walk time, right? Because let's say every one of those, that largest carton is 2 feet wide, right? Well then, if I have 4 cartons there, that's 8 feet, potentially, that I have to walk back to then put my product into that carton. So the longer that I have to travel as an operator, that takes time from me picking, and then that will detract from whatever presentation rate was ever first achievable. The other thing too is when we calculate a goods to person rate, right? We typically calculate that for what I call a 100% operator, right? So that's an operator that's working at full pace. It's a good operator, right? But how many 100% operators do you have in your operation? Not everyone. I don't care who you are or where you're located. You will not have all 100% operators. So when the system goes in, you kind of wonder, well, why is it that I'm only achieving as a total throughput 80% of, let's say, what you expected? Well, it could be because you plan for everyone to be at 100% of an operator, but that's just not how the world lives, right? So what I advise you to do is look at what you have today, your performance of your operators, and try to plan more for what we call a realistic or the average performer, the 80% performer, right? Because if you plan for the 100%, then you'll never get what you actually need because those other performers will always bring you down. And you always want the machine availability to be higher, right? So there's machine availability, then there's a 100% operator, and then there's actual achieved, right? And then the other thing you want to make sure that is included is personal fatigue and delay whenever you're calculating, your rates. Operators do not, even if they're 100% operators, do not perform the same across an 8-hour shift, right? There will be peaks and valleys when they're tired, when they're refreshed. They will have their best performance and their lowest performance. And the thing we're going to get in next is what are the direct work elements and what are the indirect times? So what we mean by direct work elements would be something where the actual operator is actually picking product and placing product. They're actually doing something. Indirect time would be, well, what if they have to wrap? Let's say they have to wrap a product to keep it from breaking, or they have to count, right? So that's considered as indirect because that is actually delaying what you want to have moving a product from the donor into the ordered tote, right? And here's the way that I tend to advise people to look at it. There's 3,600 seconds in an hour, right? So this is very simple to do. You look at, okay, well, what is my batch factor, my grabs per line? Can I actually achieve that or not? Then you start to break down the actual function of the operator. How much time does it take for them to reach into the donor and grab that product? What's the average time per grab? And then what's the time for them to put? Do they have to walk to do that put? And then what is the time that they have to address any directives? And what I mean by that is, do they have to touch a mushroom button to say I've completed the task? Do I have to touch a screen? Do I have to look at a screen to determine what cell out of the tote that I picked from? There's time for all those directives, and you don't have to be, an engineer to sit here and do a time study on everybody. If you just simply watch the operation, take your operation that you have to do. Do I have to wrap? Do I have to bag? How many units on average do I have per line? Does that require me to count? So what are those things? List those things, watch your operation, and begin to assign time to them, really. And then you can relate that to, what that is going to be now in a goods-to-person operation. So you start with that 3,600 seconds, and you begin to take all of these work elements and assign the time to them and say, if I'm expecting to get 440 lines per hour, and I have all those frequencies that I have to achieve each one of these elements at, at 440 at these times, and these times are just made up arbitrary times, just so an example, right? It would take you 4,402 seconds to achieve 440 lines per hour. Well, guess what? There's no way that's going to happen because there's not 4,400 seconds in an hour, right? So that is not going to work, right? So what you keep doing is you keep manipulating the lines per hour to where the times and the frequencies then come up to say, yes, I can actually achieve the work or the lines per hour that I need to accomplish within the 3,600 seconds. Now that middle one at 360 lines per hour, you can see that it's very borderline, right? So yes, it's right there at borderline of 3,602 seconds, right? So you could say that's achievable, but I would argue to say, that's probably at a 100% operator, right? So that's where we have to look at our non-100% operators. What can they effectively achieve? And most comfortably, I think 3,202 is around 88% of that, right? Of a 3,600 second hour. So this is how I kind of look at it. And usually this is very accurate of what you're going to achieve. So whenever you have a goods to operator system that you're evaluating, or you have, right? And you say, well, the presentation rate is, let's say, 500, totes an hour presented. That is not what you're going to achieve, right? So this session is to kind of help you understand all the calculations that go, and really it's simple calculations to go through so that you understand once it's dropped into your operation, what you will actually see from it. Now, we can't leave without talking about capacity also. So capacity that we have in a goods-to-person system is dependent on many things. First of all is what is the tote or the bin dimensions? There are systems out there that have bigger totes or bins and smaller totes and bins. Well, how much of your product actually fits in that? And you have to look at your product dimensions and your pick unit of measure. Are you picking by the each? Are you picking by the sleeve? Are you picking by the inner or the case, let's say? And then what is the replenishment unit of measure? As a best practice, what I always like to do is have the replenishment unit of measure at the next up unit of measure. Let me explain that, right? So if I'm picking eaches, I want to be able to replenish by at least a case. And where I see sometimes people kind of struggle with is they say they have their low movers, right? So I have a low mover that only moves, let's say, 3 units in a month, okay? But its case pack is 12, okay? So, and I've seen a lot of people do this. They will say, okay, well, I calculate days on hand, and I only need 1 unit in there to satisfy my days on hand, right? Well, what happens when you go to replenish? You're not going to go out into your deep storage and pick a unit out there to replenish it. That would make no sense. But I've seen that done. So you want to look at the next unit of measure up. So what you need to hold in the system is your replenishment unit of measure, which would be our case pack of 12, right? So that way, when you're going out and replenishing, you're not each picking, you're going out and getting a case. And the same could be, if I'm replenishing, picking cases, I want to be able to replenish by a layer or by a pallet, all that. So that is important. Cubic velocity, do you have fast movers, slow movers? Fast movers often drive a system to where it gets so expensive and it really doesn't make sense. If you have fast movers that you can pick at a high rate because every order hits it, right? Does it really need to be in your goods to person system? Or can you just not peel those items out, put them in a manual area? If you can pick 350 lines per hour in a manual area, and you can pick 375 out of goods to person, let's say, why put it in automation, right? Save it for the medium and the lower movers. Now, there are some instances where I would kind of argue with that, and that would be if we're really up against order cycle time, right? And you don't want to be passing orders against 2 systems. We talked a little bit about this would be the days on hand and replenishment. There's a lot of theories out there about, okay, should it be 5 days? Should it be 7 days? Should it be 14 days? Should it be 3 days? I would advise you to just do this. You do need to do some math about what the cost of the replenishment is. So if it's 5 days, okay, well, that means that you're going to replenish 1/5 of your product potentially every day. So what is that going to cost you to go out into deep reserve and to replenish? And don't forget, you got to go out in deep reserve. Then do you have to decant it, right? So do you have to take the product out of the case to put it in a bin or in a tote? Or can you simply drop that case in the tote? Well, then you're probably paying for the picker then to then open that case, right? So make sure that you calculate that all in, because a lot of times, and it becomes an exercise. We try to shrink down the size of a goods to person system to make it economical, to make it fit in a warehouse, least amount of floor space. But if we're shrinking it down to the point where it's costing you a lot of replenishment, it doesn't make sense, right? So you have to look at that and balance the two together. It's kind of like the old days of horizontal carousels. I'm not bashing horizontal carousels. I think they have a great place. But one of the problems with horizontal carousels was always keeping them replenished. The other thing we want to talk about is multiple SKUs per tote or per bin. Now, so it's another double-edged sword. If I have very small product, why wouldn't I want to keep multiple SKUs in a bin? Yes, you would. However, the thing that you have to be aware of is competition. And what I mean by that is, once you put, and this could happen to just a single SKU tote. Let's start there. If I have one SKU at a tote, there's potential for competition for that tote for other pick portals or other pick stations to need that SKU at that time. So if that occurs, that other station is going to wait for it while it's at my station, unless I have multiple totes of that SKU, right? Now, if I have a small product and I have multiple SKUs in there, think about this. I now have increased the likelihood of competition, right? Because now let's say I have 4 SKUs in a tote. Now, anytime that tote is out, traveling or in a workstation, the likelihood is now 4 times greater that someone else may need another SKU in that same tote. And again, if they exhaust everything all the work that they have, they could get in a situation where now that order is waiting because that SKU is parked somewhere else. And you say, well, that's fine. I'll eventually get to it, right? So where you have to be careful of it is when you get up against order cycle time and your service levels, right? Again, that 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock, and you're trying to make your orders get out the door, that's something that you want to be careful of. All right. And the last thing we want to talk about is return on investment and where we kind of land with a goods-to-person system, with any automation, really. And a lot of people will try to drive out every bit of labor that they can. And at that point, you're really over-automated. That's where your CapEx is going to be really, really high. You're really looking for that sweet spot where you're not under-automated, you're not over-automated, right? But it's optimal. Right there is that sweet spot that's where the ROI will be found. And the other thing that you want to look at is your variable costs compared to your capital expenses or your fixed costs, right? And what we found is that by exchanging a lot of your variable costs, right, for capital or fixed costs, what that does is give you more manageability on your overall costs, right? Because variable costs being one of them being labor, right? So if labor from day to day fluctuates because of volume, well, if I can take that variability out and put it in fixed cost, in more automation, right? Where, I have a fixed cost that I'm dealing with regardless of that velocity that I see every day, then I don't have to deal with that variable cost, which comes at a problem as far as managing and how all the other things that you have to do to accommodate the variable costs. So this is kind of a cycle that we go through, and I would encourage you to look at as if you're considering a goods-to-person system or any automation really, is kind of go through this cycle. And every cycle has to go back to value. What value are we trying to achieve? And first of all, we start with, well, what is the problem? Define the problem. And then what is the value of solving that problem? Then when we analyze the data, right, when we come up with the results of that data, what value do we have to offer to the solution from what we found? The design of the system, of what value it's going to have back to the operation, and then that build, that final implementation. So these are the top 12 takeaways that I would kind of encourage you with, and then we have enough time for Q&A. That is this. Anytime you're considering automation, especially goods to person, involve your operations team. Calculate, as we talked about, on your own, calculate the operational rate. And if you're not able to do that, take some of the things that we've talked about today and have your vendor, the integrator, whoever you're working with, and have them break that down for you. See how much homework they have done, and then have them apply your operational perspective to it, right? To say, well, no, I don't think you're going to be able to achieve 500 lines per hour, and here's this why. Well, let's change that variable. Let's change this variable. Let's add this variable, right? And you're not trying to barter with them. It's all about coming down to a solution that both parties can be happy with at the end of the day. Know your standard operator performance rate, and that comes back to that 100% operator. How many good operators do you have? You will always have that mix. How has that mix been applied to your productivity rates? This was a big one of mine, and that is operational cadence. So I'm 46 plus years into the industry, and 20 some years of that was spent in your shoes, operating distribution centers and fulfillment centers. And one of the things that I always look for is the operating cadence of a building. What is that drum beat? I should be able to feel it. I should be able to see it. And believe me, it is there. Whenever I go to audit or assess operations, that's one of the first things I look for. We also want to simplify work methods. So if our existing work methods are very cumbersome, let's see what we can eliminate. Let's not introduce that into the automation. Let's see how we can offset that or not do that at all, right? Don't design to an average. As a data guy, you never want to be designing on average. Averages will always get you into trouble because at any given minute, any given hour, any given day, you're never at average. So I always say this, if you design to average, I hope you never expect to be above average because that's going to kind of be where you're at. Avoid linear processes and silos. So if we, where we talked about, you can have some SKUs in a manual operation, some SKUs in automation. What you don't want those two things to look like is a linear process to where it's got to go here, then it's got to go there, right? Because you'll end up with bottlenecks, you'll end up with silos. What you want to have is have it be dynamic where I can start here, then go over here, start here and go over here, right? And for the reason for that is because it never at any given hour, at any given minute, those two things will be imbalanced to where you thought they would be. So they need to be able to flow dynamically. Allow adequate queuing. This is very important at goods to person stations, especially for the orders, the order cartons, the order totes that come in. There's a need for a queue. And what I mean by that is, let's say we have a conveyance coming into a goods to operator station that's providing the order cartons, right? So that queue will help the goods to person retrieval by knowing what's immediately upstream of it. So if I have a queue of, let's say, 15 minutes, right? They may have started pre-planning a half hour, an hour, 2 hours ago, but within that 15 minutes, they know exactly what's coming next, right? So it's important to have that queue in front of every station. Provide sufficient capacity in the automation to reduce excessive replenishments. We talked about that, right? Let's make sure our days on hand is accurate. Plan for worst case, rainy day scenarios. And what I mean by that is a lot of times there will always be exceptions. But if you go through your homework, what you'll try to do is identify those exceptions upstream, see how many you can eliminate, see how many you can mitigate, and reduce them down to their lowest form. Create an operating plan to sustain material flow. And this one's it's kind of like cadence. It's kind of a no-brainer. You have to be able to sustain material flow, order flow constantly throughout the day. Where you see workstations or subsystems dry up or overwhelm, that means you don't have really good sustained material flow. And lastly, don't base your solution on predefined order profiles. They will always change. If you base it on, okay, well, on average, I've got 3.5 lines per order, 1.2 units per line. Okay, well, at what point in time was that, and how did you measure that? You probably took it by over some long period of time. But what happens at Christmas? Now I get a lot of singles, or I get a lot more multis, right? When something goes on sale, I get a lot of more singles because everybody just wants that one item. But then when I get into a seasonal aspect, I introduce a lot more multiple lines. So you have to understand what the sensitivities are of the system when that profile changes, because it will change, okay? So that's the 12 takeaways, and we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. If anybody has any questions at all about calculating a throughput or anything I've discussed today. Anybody? Okay. So the gentleman was asking about staffing and how to use staffing and what metrics and some tools, right, that you use. So I would say that comes back to having a plan, right? So as we talked about, it kind of comes back down to your volumes. On the outbound, let's talk about when your orders come in. Because what I see a lot of times is orders aren't available, or at least not very many orders are available, let's say at first thing in the morning. You come in at 7 o'clock in the morning and you only need 2 pickers. But when that 4 p.m. hits, well, now I've got, half of my day's orders are right there. So the automation has to be able to provide, if your service level is in by 4, out by 5, I'm just, again, using that as an example, you have to be able to plan the automation to satisfy that amount. And I've seen it this high where 20% of your total day's volume happens within that last 1 to 2 hours of that day, right there before cutoff. So the automation has to be able to support that. So that comes at a ROI challenge, right? But what you can do to offset that is have some flexibility in that. When you talk about AMRs, you can park them, bring them back out, but you still have the added cost, unless you're doing some sort of, service, or something like that. But on your terms of staffing, I think you have to look at flexible staffing models, right? And you have to know your plan. And so when you come into the day, I like to always say, okay, well, how many trucks do we have? How many cartons do we have coming in the door? What's our orders plan for the day? And then on that cadence, what I always did with my operators is we had hourly cadence calls where every supervisor in every area would call in and say, here's what I've got going on today, and here's where I'm at hour 1. Am I behind or am I ahead of plan? Well, you're behind plan. Well, that usually means someone else is ahead of plan, right? So then you move an operator from this area to that area, right? Because what you got to look at is the total daily plan for the warehouse. That tells you how many total heads you need, and you should be able to shuffle people back and forth between those areas as your cadence permits, right? Does that help? Sorry? Okay. Yeah, so the question was, well, what tools can you use to see, how you're doing and the labor that you need? So that can actually be provided in a couple of different ways. Sometimes, in perspective of goods to person, that will actually be in part of their software to display, a plan, how far they are to plan. As far as the whole building, though, you really need to look at an LMS, a labor management system. And usually, and some WMSs will do some of that. But what you want to be able to do is having your LMS, so a labor management system, to where that will manage your whole building. It'll show you diagnostics, who's ahead of plan, who's behind plan. And also what it can help you do is manage the training for your people. So who do you have trained on a forklift that can drive a forklift? So not everybody you can just hop on a forklift, right? And who do you have trained to work in goods to person? So that was the other thing too, is always have your people trained up so that you can float them from area to area. Okay. Any other questions? Yes. So the question was, a very good question, how to calculate batch factor. So a lot of times the mistake, at least I perceive it as a mistake that I see, is folks will take a large pool of data. They may take as much as a year. I've seen this done. And they'll take a year's worth of data and they will say, oh, okay, well, I see that 20% of the time I could pick to one SKU will satisfy more than one order, right? That's really bad. So what I advise you to do is to slice it down to what is real for you. So when we talk about order pull and order release, so if you can only give them an hour's worth of work at a time, what you need to do is take different days, take couple of average days, couple of peak days, take those and slice them into hour increments and say, well, once I reach this hour, what is that batch factor? Well, then there's one other step, because let's say within an hour you do 2,000 orders. But let's say you have 10 different pick stations within your goods to person, right? So now you got to slice that by 10. So that's how I would calculate it. Take it down to my order pull down to the lowest denominator and then divide that into the number of pickers that I think I would have. Most of the time, batch factoring is really, really low. When you start doing it at that level, it's, whenever I hear 1.2, my ears kind of, or something like that, I'm like, my ears are perking up, I'm going, show me. And usually what I will do is have them, we will run numbers for a batch factor of 1. In other words, no batch factor at all. And see what the diff is. Because there are going to be times when that's all you'll get is a 1. Okay. Anything else? Robotic being articulated arm piece picking? Okay. So the question was about robotic piece picking or articulated arm piece picking at goods to person stations. I think that's right around the corner. There are a lot of folks out there in the industry now that are doing that fairly well. It's all about form factor, right? The robots have finally got up to a speed to where they can perform a rate as equal to a person, but it's about form factor, right? So if you have, clothing that's not in a bag, for example, and you have it just laying in a tote, that robot could have a hard time picking that up. Or it may pick that up, but what about the next time it's a cylinder, it's a soft rubber ball? Okay, well then do I have to change the heads? Can I pick it up? So it's form factor. The other thing I would encourage you to look at is how they handle their uptime or their exceptions, right? So you'll have 2 theories, right? One theory is, okay, stop the robot and a person has to come over and solve that problem. The other theory is they will pipe that operation with a camera back to a remote station, and maybe that remote station was within your warehouse, or it can even be off-site, to where someone with that can see that camera and see what that robot is stopped at, and can somehow instruct that robot what to do. Right? That's the 2 things. I do believe that that's right around the corner where adoptability will become much higher. We're not quite there yet. The investment and the return on investment, I think right now is kind of borderline, but I definitely think that's something that we all should be looking at. Did that answer your question? Anything else? Okay. All right. So was this something that you got something out of, I hope? All right. Well, thank you much for your time, and enjoy the conference and have a great day.